all once.
Oh,
yeah.
Okay.
And in 2:15, he's talking about the cross there. He's talking about the record held against us. This is set aside, nailing it to the cross. And then I thought this was amazing, especially in light of what you just told me about the empire. He disarmed the rulers and authorities and made a public example of them, triumphing over them in it.
Is that 2:15 there?
Yeah, in Colossians 2:15. That he disarms these rulers and authorities, and he makes a public example of them. The rulers and authorities put him on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
He makes a public example of them on the cross, and he triumphs over them. But the cross is actually a symbol of them triumphing over him. Mm-hmm. But Paul says, no, it's the exact opposite.
Well, and what's amazing about that is that public example, that refers to, when a Caesar when a ruler would come back from battle, and he would have this parade, this victory parade. And in that parade would be, that woman I told you about, kneeling. In that parade, he would have all these captives, all these people he had taken and probably brutalized in some way, and they would be shackled, and they would have to walk along and be part of that victory parade. They would be the ones that everybody could look at and jeer at and make fun of, right? They would be the example. You don't want this to happen to you, so you better just give in to Rome now, rather than let Rome. Don't resist, because this is what's going to happen. But it says what's interesting is Jesus, and they were all disarmed, right? All their arms were taken away. Jesus, he disarms the rulers and authorities, and he makes a public example of them, not by shaming them in this terrible victory parade, but he makes a public example of them on the cross. So his triumph over them isn't this violent shaming. His triumph over them is by showing what they're really like. What's at the heart of empire? But this kind of violence. And that's how Jesus exposes who the empire is. And it's by bearing that violence rather than giving that violence back. So it's an incredibly, I don't know what's the word for it. It's this completely different story that has nothing to do with going out and engaging in the kind of justice for peace that the empire engaged in, right? It's a suffering of violence for the sake of peace. It's very, very different than the story of the empire.
Well, this is a Y-Sox kind of study group that we're part of with all the Y-Sox leaders.
Apparently.
And one of the things that brings me to a Y-Sox kind of event is I want to know the so what, right? I'm really excited by how you're unpacking this for me. I'm really excited about seeing how radical and subversive Colossians was. It was almost like it was a tract written against the empire. Mm-hmm. That's really, really exciting in terms of understanding this text, which I take as scripture from the first century. How does it relate to us? How does this empire stuff relate to us?
Have you ever heard of something called dynamic analogy?
No.
Okay. Dynamic analogy. It's, you know what an analogy is, right? When you compare two things, sort of see how they're analogous, how they compare to each other, how they fit together, how you can draw examples across from one to the other.
Yeah.
Well, a dynamic analogy is an analogy that isn't wooden, right? You don't say, Paul said this and this happens in our life, and therefore this applies exactly to our life.
Right.
Right? Dynamic analogy means you try to figure out what's the context. What is the parallel to our context? What might be different about our context from the first century context? And how might we draw the connections between this part of the story and our part of the story in a way that is alive, that is living, that is not just repeating what came before. So dynamic analogy means you need to ask some questions. This text was written to people living in empire. Do we live in a similar kind of context? Can you think of a way of talking about our context that is comparable to the imperial context that people lived in the first century? Can you?
Well,
think of anything?
Well, yeah. It helps me think about it if I try to put together some of the things you said about empire. So if I was to summarize what we were talking about, empires seem to always be engaged in some sort of centralization of power. Rome's a clear example of that. That they engage in socioeconomic and military control over those who are subject to this centralized power. Picking up on what you just said about stories, they all seem to have a pretty strong dose of mythology, right? There's some sort of a story, whether it might be the story of Rura Britannica or the Manifest Destiny or the Pax Romana, that there's always a narrative, some sort of a mythology which undergirds an empire and which also demonstrates why the empire is actually on the proper course of history. And if you're going to oppose empire, then really you're putting yourself to the margins of history. You're not really part of history. And then the fourth thing about that's about images. That empires seem to capture people not just by means of socioeconomic and military control, but more importantly, by telling stories and having the images of empire so ubiquitous that empire just seems inevitable. Right?
That's a great summary. You should write that down somewhere.
I'll try that.
That would be really good. Yeah.
So we've got these four things. I mean, just as I was talking about the mythology, I was thinking about Francis Fukuyama. Remember that guy who wrote the essay "The End of History" some years ago? And what he argued there was that liberal democratic capitalism had simply won the ideological battle of history.
Oh wait, he wrote this right after the fall of the Berlin Wall.
Right after the fall of the Berlin Wall. He's tried to take it back a little bit because he's embarrassed by George Bush. But but I'm not sure he can take back what he said. And one of the things that Fukuyama said in his book, The End of History, was that there was no other path forward in history except liberal democratic capitalism. And those who did not accept liberal democratic capitalism were prehistorical.
Prehistorical.
Like they weren't part of history. And then he said, now, of course, there will be skirmishes at the edges of history. Any further battles, because the Cold War had been won, there was no ideological battle left between the Soviet communism and the liberal democratic capitalism. Any battles left would be at skirmishes at the edge of history.
So is Iraq a little skirmish?
It's a real, it's kind of a big skirmish at the edge of history, but maybe at the center of history. So, I mean, that makes me think that is there centralization of power? You ask anybody in the third world if there's a centralization of power, and they're pretty clear that there is, in terms of how the Western world functions, how trade laws function, how goods travel, how raw resources move. There's centralization of power. There's socioeconomic kinds of control, and when that doesn't quite work, you send in the military, and we've got wars all around the world, big and large, about that. There seems to be a dominant story here, the story of Enlightenment, humanist progress, and we're at the apex of that story. And images, pretty hard-pressed to find somebody in the world who can't recognize a Coca-Cola logo, or a Macintosh logo, or an IBM logo.
IBM has a logo?
Yeah, IBM has a logo.
It's IBM, right?
Well, yeah, but you make it recognized as IBM.
I was just thinking, maybe they had a pear instead of an apple.
It's undoubtedly different. It's not one nation state, though Rome wasn't quite a nation state, but it's not one national kind of identity that rules the whole world, though there is one that's kind of big in the whole story. I think there are differences, but I think that maybe, global capitalism? I mean, I want to give cheap analysis here, but does global capitalism work as a name and a description for our imperial context? What do you think?
Well, I think it could. And then what does Romans 1:15-20 mean? If this was a subversive word of hope to people in the first century, under the Roman imperial story, then how does Romans 1:15-20 function as a word of hope in our time, under global capitalism, under rising militarism?
And
how does it function? Under a creation that is groaning, to use Paul's words, more and more and more, under the strain we're putting it on?